Morning, everyone. My name is Christina. I'm head of sales at Kenor Finance and Business Services. I'll open by sharing some information on Kenor. We're Ireland's most popular online accountancy and company secretarial practice for SMEs. Our mission is to provide superb financial and business support services to ambitious SMEs, high potential startups, and larger businesses wherever they are. We've been recognised by Irish Accountancy Awards for our efforts and most recently won Online Practice of the Year and Client Services Team of the Year. The Kenor is headed up by our CEO, Larissa Feeney, who is herself a chartered accountant. We have a team of over 70 professionals across the areas of compliance and tax, bookkeeping, payroll, management accounting, company secretarial, as well as a dedicated client success and client services teams. I'm delighted to be hosting this morning's webinar with Boundless CEO Dee Coakley. Good morning, Dee. Thank you for joining us. Dee is a seasoned executive with extensive expertise in international employment. Dee has a profound understanding of the operational challenges associated with cross-border employment and payroll. She founded Boundless, a leading employer of record, to streamline global employment by integrating compliance, expert support, and a robust platform into one comprehensive solution. The one important thing to note is that this webinar is recorded and will be shared with you all after. It is for general information purposes only, and we would ask you to inquire directly for specific advice. So I'll hand over to you now, Dee, to begin.
Thank you so much, Christina, and hello, everyone. Before I start, I should mention I do have the terrible cough that so many people have at the moment. So I'm hoping I'm just at the end of it. So fingers crossed it won't affect me today, but mentioning it in advance, just in case. So thanks for having me here. Delighted to share this with Kenor and with the group that we have here today. As Christina mentioned, I'll be talking to you today about building a winning global employment strategy. So whether you have an international team or you're considering building out a team internationally, it may be that you're just looking at hiring one person abroad. We will cover that today. So as Christina mentioned there, my name is Dee Coakley. I am co-founder and CEO of a business called Boundless. Before I founded Boundless, I spent 10 years in COO roles with B2B SaaS companies, B2B software as a service companies. In those roles, I oversaw the HR, finance, and legal functions. And the last company that I was with very organically ended up with an internationally distributed team. It was something that happened to us organically over time. And it was during that time that I firsthand experienced the challenges of trying to figure out HR compliance and payroll for workers in countries where I had no experience and no network. And that was painful. It was very tricky, very challenging. And that experience led me to founding Boundless. Boundless is a platform that handles HR compliance, employment, and payroll compliance for international teams. And the company was founded in 2019. We are a remote first business. Our team are across 12 countries. So I myself live and breathe the realities of running an international team. In terms of what we'll cover today, we will look at what your options are for your overseas workers. We'll look at the implications of managing global employment in-house versus outsourcing. We'll look at how you make your decision around all of this. And then if you do think that an employer of record is the right kind of partner for you, we'll talk about how you make that selection. So what are your options when you're looking to engage an international workforce? And when I say workforce, as I mentioned at the start, this could be anything from one worker that you've organically come across in another country, or it could be that you are very proactively looking to build out teams in multiple territories, or you might be considering your approach to hiring and talent over the coming years. So these are the main, we're about to look at the main options for managing global employment. We have direct entity employment. I will talk about each of these in a little more detail in a moment. We have contractor agreements. We have working as a foreign employer. So where you're, for example, Irish entity or wherever your main entity is, that entity acting as the employer for the worker in other countries. Or we have an employer of record. Some of these options are fully compliant, others may pose some compliance challenges. While at Boundless, we are very firmly focused on compliance. We're very proud of being a fully compliant option. We won't cut corners. We will always lean into full compliance. But for you, it will be up to you to decide which option best fits your business's needs and use case at any particular point in time. And I forgot to say at the start, Christina, please do jump in, or indeed any of the audience, if you have any questions at any point in time, do jump in. I'd love this to be discussion based. Happy to stop and chat as we go. And I might miss you waving at me or signaling to me, so do feel free to unmute your mic and jump in there, Christina.
I certainly will, Dee. Thank you for that. And I forgot to mention as well, so thank you for mentioning it. There's a Q&A feature and a chat feature within this webinar. So for all of our audience, feel free to put any questions there and I'll put them to Dee on your behalf. Thank you, Dee.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I mentioned compliance there a moment ago.
Yeah.
What do we mean when we talk about compliance? And before we dive into explaining each of these different options, conscious I've just highlighted the titles there, but I will explain in a little more detail what each of these are. Before we dive into that, let's just talk about what I mean when we compare compliant to non-compliant approaches. What do I mean by compliance? So every country in the world has its own set of rules and regulations relating to hiring, contracts, working hours, wages, benefits, and so much more. As a foreign employer, a company that perhaps doesn't have any pre-existing operations or infrastructure in the country where a worker is based, the local authorities in the country where your worker is based will expect you to be fully compliant with the regulations of their country. So it's worth bearing in mind you can write anything you want in a contract, but if you were an Irish company employing someone in France or a UK company employing someone in Canada, you will have to comply with the employment laws of the country the worker is in. Even if you issue an employment agreement that states that that contract is applicable under Irish law and outlining the Irish regulations for the worker, that contract simply isn't worth the paper it's written on. The example I always give, it's a bit of a crude example, but I always say we all understand that if we're on holidays in Spain and we commit a murder while we're there on vacation, even if we arrive back in Ireland before we are committed of that crime, it will be the laws of Spain that apply and we will be tried under that jurisdiction. So it is always the jurisdiction where the work is being carried out. That is the jurisdiction that applies. It is those employment regulations that you will need to adhere to. So generally speaking, compliance refers to the practice of adhering to laws, regulations, standards, and ethical practices that apply to an organization's operations within a given country. Compliance in a global employment capacity typically encompasses a number of things, such as ensuring you are appropriately classifying your workers, ensuring you're aligning with health and safety regulations. You need to ensure you have the correct entity set up. Now, the correct entity setup may be that your Irish entity is absolutely fine, but in some jurisdictions, you may need a local entity, or in some circumstances, you need to be managing your tax obligations locally in that country. We will talk specifically and only about employment taxes today, but separately you may need and will probably want to look at sales taxes and corporate taxes. It's not an area that we would advise on. Again, going back to employment, you need to ensure you're following the correct termination procedures in each country. And believe me, that's the one that tends to be the trickiest. It's the one where we spend a lot of time on with our clients, and it's terminations and how they work in the country where the workers are based. That's the one that I'd be very focused on if you're considering hiring someone in a new country. Aligning leave policies and various other aspects that might directly or indirectly influence employment. What does it mean if you overlook compliance? Well, this can result in legal penalties, financial loss to your business, and overall damage to the company's reputation. And that could be damage in terms of your employer brand. It could be damage in terms of your brand with customers and with those local authorities in that country. And this is why it's so important to be proactive about understanding the local requirements at the point of setting up company operations or taking on a worker in a new country. We'll talk a little about this later, but the level of risk that's appropriate for your business, everyone on this call, different levels of risk might be appropriate for different businesses at different stages.
And Dee, it's really interesting that you talk about the risks there and like the compliance risks, the legal risks, the I suppose the penalties for non-compliance, as you've touched on there. What would you say, you know, to a company that's considering maybe just taking on one employee and that they feel that they can manage it with their in-house teams? And I'm sure you come up against this often where they think, okay, it's one employee I can manage and we'll research enough from here on that other country.
And certainly sometimes companies do this. There's a reality, you know, I have been involved in the startup space for many years. The approach that you take in the very earlier stages, or when you're a very small business or when you're very cash constrained, is very, very different to the approach that you would take with a larger business. And you know, you're not going to want to boil the ocean. You need to take the approach that's appropriate for you. Having said that, there is an unfortunate reality that there's almost as much heavy lifting with that one. The first person is so much more work and so much harder than any subsequent individuals that will come after that, because it really is scoping out the territory, figuring out your compliant employment agreement, understanding your obligations the first time round. After that, all other employees are falling under those same obligations. I'll talk in a bit about what that entails and what that involves, and I'll also talk about the approach you might like to take to risk. But it's a really good question.
And your answer is actually really interesting as well, Dee, because as you say, people could think, okay, well, look, this is just my first one, I'll figure it out myself. When in reality, you're far better off taking the advice for that very first one and really going for best foot forward, particularly if it's going to form part of your long-term strategy to hire international talent.
And this is the thing, you know, ending up accidentally being an international employer where, for example, one of your workers choose to move overseas. And there are a number of reasons why you might end up in this situation. It may be that one of valued team member of yours is relocating and you want them to retain their job and work remotely. It may be that you're struggling to find the right talent locally and you need to look further afield, particularly if you're looking for specialist workers. That, you know, I've had this experience in the past, looking for data scientists, software engineers, can't always find someone commuting distance from your office. It could be that you very organically, you're hiring for a role and very organically you're given a CV for a great candidate that happens to be in another territory. It could be that you're investing in a market. You want to open a sales office in that market, and you know, you're making your first few hires there. There's a very big difference between investing in a territory. If you're going to open an office, you're registering an entity, you know you're going to have corporate and sales tax obligations, you'll need an accountant and lawyer in territory. That's a very kind of full fat, full on approach to entering a territory. It's very different if very organically you end up with this person and it's incidental that they're based in this territory. So you'll want to adapt your approach based on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Dee. Sorry, I'll let you go on.
Don't apologize. Feel free to jump in at any time.
Thanks.
So that screen I showed before where I set out broadly the 4 key options that you have, or the main options that you have as a company with a worker entering a new territory. The first one we'll look at here is direct entity employment. So this is where the company goes the route of setting up as a fully compliant local employer. This will often involve a local entity. Now, if you're going EU to EU, you won't always have to have an entity in country. What we're talking about here is where you do have an entity in country. And there may be reasons why you might want to do that even EU to EU. For example, if you operate in a regulated space and the person or people you're hiring in country are going to be selling or performing whatever the regulated activities are, you know, I know we've often had inquiries from venture capital funds in the past, and we can support their employees where those employees are software engineers or marketing people. But if they're investors, we can't compliantly support those people because the venture capital fund would need to hold that regulation in that territory. So in a case like that, you might register an entity locally. Certainly, employing someone directly in country will involve a local tax registration. You will have to register to handle your employment taxes. And once you have that entity, you will most likely be registering for sales tax and corporate taxes as well. Setting up your own legal entity in a country and managing employment through that is a compliant option. You will not need, you know, all of your worries about compliance will go away, provided you're looking at some of the HR things and payroll things we'll talk about in a moment. But there are some implications that it's very important to understand. In pros, you will have that limited exposure to compliance risks, assuming you have access to appropriate expertise. And we'll talk a little bit later about the kind of expertise that you need to have in-house to support this kind of thing. Directly employing can offer a great employee experience. By employee experience, what I mean is, for most of us who've been employees, much of the working population has never been an independent contractor or has never owned their own business or been self-employed. So there is often an expectation, particularly in Ireland, actually, more so than in some countries, that when someone accepts a job, they will be given an employment contract. They will be entitled to all of the rights as an employee, and they will receive all of the benefits that an employee would ordinarily receive. When you're going this direct employment route, you are delivering that great employee experience to the worker. The worker knows where they stand. Now, that good employee experience is, of course, going to be dependent on you having the right internal knowledge of local payroll and HR. You may have a wonderful HR team, but if your HR team are all Irish and their expertise is all local, they don't know what they don't know. And your French employee, for example, is going to have an expectation that they get meal vouchers, because although it's not a statutory entitlement in France, it's culturally absolutely the norm. They will also have the right to disconnect, for example. So you cannot send them emails outside of working hours. And although you might employ them directly, if your HR team don't understand these things, that worker is not going to perceive this as a great experience. And of course, then that has implications for retention and performance. And ultimately, we all know that retention and performance are the things that lead to cost. Were you going to ask me a question there, Christina?
I was just going to say it's a fascinating insight you have there just on that one country alone, you know. So I'm sure that there's nuances like that across all the countries in the world. And even though, as you say, the assumption would be there that we're EU, that a lot of our laws and regulations are similar, that example alone shows that there's just so many nuances to consider.
Really good point, Christina, and I'm really glad you brought that up, actually. When I meet people and even socially, when I meet people and I tell them what I do, a lot of people have this assumption that there is some form of harmonization around employment regulations across the EU. And I guess we've all heard through the media and in our employment agreements, we've heard of things like the Working Time Directive and things like that. The reality is, very few of our employment regulations are controlled or even directed, even in a light way, from the EU. They're domestic. And if we think culturally I will go back to the French again, because we all know the French strike so regularly. We all have cultural associations with the employment rights that we get. And these are deep seated, and they are driven by the employment regulations locally. But if you look at something like paid time off, France is actually the most extreme example here. French workers are entitled to 41 days off a year. Now that includes public holidays, but 41 days, it's a lot chunkier than, say, the US, where it's 10 days. But there are a lot of leaves that various countries will give. So a lot of countries now will have domestic violence leave. A lot of countries will have leave when it's an immediate family member's wedding. You're entitled to a day's paid time off. That's not something we're familiar with here in Ireland. So leaves and paid time off are one aspect of it. Another thing is employment agreements. What does and does not go in an employment agreement varies hugely territory to territory. The first time I employed someone in the US, it was in New York State. And of course, every US state has its own employment laws, has its own tax laws. I was astonished that in New York State, people never receive an employment agreement. You have no contractual entitlements as an employee. You have very few rights as an employee. You're given a letter saying you're going to work for the company. It is a hire at will, fire at will state. So your employer anytime can say to you, don't come back tomorrow. And that is, it will be, the thing is, there are the statutory entitlements and then there are the cultural norms. Cultural norm there will be 1 week's notice. It will be considered very harsh for a good employer to say, don't come back tomorrow. It will be 1 week's notice, but your employer can say, don't come back tomorrow. And I remember sitting in an employment lawyer's office in New York and asking about maternity leave. And she kind of looked at me aghast and said, well, as an employer, if you have an employee that gives birth to a baby, you can tell them they have to be back at work the next day. Again, there would be a norm that people would usually give 2 weeks. But you're not obliged to. You could say that person needs to be back at work the day after they have their baby. So obviously very different here, and expectations around things like maternity leave and paternity leave will vary greatly. Sweden, for example, it is much more common mothers and fathers share paternity leave, and it is very common for the male partner to take a very significant period of time. That is just the norm there. That they will take quite a few months, sometimes up to a year. So moving on with our direct employment, this is very cost effective. Excuse me. This is cost effective at higher headcounts. It's really difficult to say what that number is.
Okay.
But once you go over 40 people in a specific country, this is probably going to be the best route for you. So then let's take, I'm sorry, my throat is at me. I'm going to turn my aircon off because I think that's drying the air out, which isn't helping.
Of course, Dee, take your time.
Thank you.
And fascinating insights there on all the countries. Sorry, I hadn't realized I was on mute for a moment. That you've shared there. So it's very clear that you have very broad knowledge of the global employment sphere, not just specific to Europe, even that it's very much global. And mad the level of changes. I don't know how anyone could go into it thinking that you could manage that from a local entity, really.
Yeah, it's very, very, very difficult. Yeah, we operate in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, right across Europe. We've fairly recently registered our entity in South Africa, so
Okay.
starting to move further south.
Right.
So in terms of the cons of this approach of going directly, there is a significant financial commitment and heavy lifting to get started. It's very time consuming, both at initial setup and ongoing.
Okay.
Registering a company in Ireland is really straightforward.
Mm.
It can take up to 12, 18 months in a lot of countries. I've heard of countries where it can take up to 3 years. Now that's extremely rare, but quite often, for example, you will have to set up a local bank account as foreign directors. That can be extremely slow. And then it can take about a year to shut down operations in a country if it's not working out. I say a year, depending on the time in the year relative to the tax year, it could take you about 18 months. There are high levels of complexity with this. There are unknowns around how obligations or costs will evolve over time. a country like Brazil, the tax rules in Brazil change on average every few days. There will be a new tax rate implemented, wild swings in legislation throughout the year. So you need to stay on top of all of that, both on the HR and payroll side. But if you have an entity in that country, you have to stay on top of the corporate and financial reporting side. So you will need a team that have that kind of experience. It's inflexible. It's pretty much a permanent solution, and slow and expensive to unwind, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
So let's look at contractor agreements. And I was about to say many people on the call, possibly everyone on the call today, will have independent contractors or will have worked with some in the past. So independent contracting is where your workers are locally registered as sole traders or limited liability company owners, and they invoice for their work. So you have no direct employment relationship. For most countries, having people work for you as independent contractors is in most cases not a compliant or legal way to engage full-time workers.
Okay.
Most governments around the world have very specific definitions for worker classification, i.e. what type of worker can be classified as an independent contractor and when someone should be classified as an employee. If the person you're hiring is working for your company full-time, if their work is directed by someone at your company, if they're using your company's hardware or they have a company email address or attend internal meetings at your company, then in the eyes of the local authorities in most countries, they are not an independent contractor. They are by default an employee. You can have whatever kind of commercial agreement you want. They may have a registered entity locally in the country. They may tell you they're set up as a company. That does not, the worker classification regulations and laws do not evaporate just because someone writes something on a piece of paper. They will still apply. There are some exceptions particularly for certain types of seasonal work.
Okay.
For example, somewhere like Spain, for people doing agricultural work or working in tourism. Some countries, and the only one I know of actually is Ukraine. They have a very different rules. The Ukrainian government have always historically been very pro-independent contracting, and independent contractors get very preferential tax rates and so on. But that's a real exception.
Okay.
So the pros are that it's the cheapest option, since the employer doesn't contribute towards their employees' social security protections, pension, or health insurance. Now, any smart independent contractor is going to factor all of that into their pricing anyhow, so you will likely ultimately end up paying for it. The great thing about it is immediate start and termination. No tricky employee terminations. You can turn it on and off. Easy to hire an unlimited headcount anywhere in the world. Cons, it does not give the worker the experience of being an employee. Now, for some workers, they really won't mind that. But for some workers, that will be a big problem. They won't have equal rights. They'll lack social security protections and benefits. They have to self-manage their taxes, which if someone hasn't done that before, they can be a little allergic to that. They may struggle to access mortgages or other types of debt financing. And this may mean that you will have challenges attracting and retaining talent. Having one tier of employees and another of contractors can create a sense of the contractors being second-class citizens, which can cause challenges with team cohesion. And you see that quite a lot at the very large tech companies will have workers that they bring in from external service providers to ensure they're managing this worker classification. They won't give the same access to those external outsourced staffing agency workers, and those people do feel like second-class citizens. They're treated like second-class citizens. So, from a performance perspective, then that will impact that performance. And again, it's a risk you may choose to take because that may work for the type of worker you want. Very high exposure to compliance, legal, and employee misclassification risks with this one, and that could potentially lead to fines and reputational damage.
So very risky option, essentially, Dee, but one that we see more and more often as being used. Do you feel that there are different governments that really get that, I suppose, control over that across different regions better than we do here?
Absolutely. The Irish government are very light touch on this.
Right.
Now, I don't know. I say that because I personally haven't seen them take action very regularly, but I know I mention it to other founders and CEOs from time to time, and they will say that they have had the revenue approach them about worker misclassification. I mean, the revenue have clear guidance on this on their website. And you can go in and look and see as your worker. I mean, what I've outlined, if someone works full time for you,
Mhm.
the revenue in Ireland do not consider them an independent contractor. They should be classified as an employee. In Ireland, independent contractors and employees will say pay the same levels of income tax.
Mhm.
That is different in some other countries. From the revenues perspective, they want you to be paying the employer taxes on those workers, and you are evading taxes. You are a tax evader if you're not paying those employer taxes for someone that's working for you full time.
Yeah.
In other countries, the net tax, the employee tax treatment can be different. So, you know, those governments really don't want those workers evading those taxes. And it
Yeah.
certainly happens. There's a sector I won't mention right now that we've been doing some work with recently, and they would very regularly have people from Ireland going and working on site internationally. And it's just the norm in this sector that people work as independent contractors. But it is known in the sector that a lot of these workers are not declaring their taxes in the countries where they're performing the work,
Right.
traveling over and back to Ireland quite regularly.
Yes.
That is hugely risky, and the whole industry, the whole sector is starting to say we have to sort this out.
Okay.
But hugely risky because the company is then evading taxes locally in that country. The worker is evading taxes locally in that country. Local governments are starting to look at this and look at this sector more and more. And you know, you hear all the time in the media about worker misclassification cases.
Jeez.
So when the legal cases with the likes of Uber and delivery riders, that's worker misclassification.
Yeah.
Then once you have that case law, it applies to any of your workers as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of caution to be urged when people are looking at that, and probably not enough importance put on that when people are deciding on contractors. So yeah, really helpful insights
And
there. Thanks, Dee.
people often think, I'll have them as an independent contractor as an interim thing, and eventually I'll
Yeah,
sort it out. And 3 years later, that person is still working on the same contract.
yeah,
Happened to us all.
that's
So
it.
next up, we'll talk about employing international teams as a foreign employer, and this will be compliant in most cases. So this enables you to enter a market in a cost-effective way. So this means your Irish entity, for example, the actual Irish entity will act as the employer of the worker in country. So there's lower financial investment compared to establishing a full legal entity. It's fairly easy to enter and exit markets based on your business needs. This is a good solution for testing new markets. Now, assuming you have the right team members who can run this structure, it may take you may be able to register in as short a period of time as a few weeks. So if, for example, you register for a tax number, an Irish entity, if you register for an employer tax number with HMRC in the UK, it does take about 3 weeks. They're really easy to deal with. It's very straightforward. Now, if you're looking to do that somewhere like France or Portugal, you could be waiting months for that tax number. It does vary country to country, but it's probably not going to be as slow as registering an entity. And then you're going to have to find a lawyer locally to establish compliant employment agreement templates, but it's lighter than full entity establishment. You will be exposed to limited legal and compliance risks with this, but you will have increased reliance on local legal, payroll, and tax advisors to make sure you're staying compliant.
Okay.
In terms of cons, this is a temporary solution for small teams. Now, we hear the number up to 5 employees. You know, I did have on the deck originally up to 5 employees, and once you go over 5 to 10 employees, it becomes problematic. It's difficult for me to verify that exact number. It's one we hear very regularly. What is the exact number? you know, there is no global body that has established what this number is, but generally there will be an expectation by local authorities that you would have a local entity once you're moving up into higher numbers of employees. I think there was a question there, was there, Christina?
There was a question that came through. Are there any special considerations with regards to working with interns, is the question.
Oh, that's a good question. So different countries, and I'm going to hold my hand up and say this is not something that we get involved in. So it's not something I have direct experience of, but I do know that different countries will have different regulations around interns and how you treat interns. I worked in the music industry many, many years ago, and back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the music industry was run by unpaid interns. And if you turned up at any of I worked in London, if you turned up at any of the big record companies there, just full of young people working unpaid. There were changes in the regulations in the UK, for example, many years ago, probably 15 or 20 years ago, to say that interns need to be paid, you know, they need to be paid something. You cannot have people working unpaid for you long term. So you would need to check out what the requirements are locally. I mean, broadly, interns they will fall under employment regulations. They will have some of those entitlements and protections. So you're going to need to look into the protections in that country.
Okay, that's helpful. I would say Dee and Gordon do share any other follow-up questions that you have. But ultimately you're saying, Dee, that even with interns and if it's unpaid or anything, that they could still fall into the compliance and regulations.
Well, there will certainly be some
Yeah,
regulations.
of course.
What those regulations are will vary country to country. So
Yeah,
you need to understand what they are.
yeah, that's helpful.
Mm.
Thanks.
No problem. So back on our cons here, there is an increased admin burden with this
Mm.
one, as you will have to source and engage local payroll professionals. So remember, you're the Irish entity, for example, but you're registered for employer taxes in country where the workers are. You have to process the payroll compliantly in that country. And that's always the case. You can't ever have a worker in another country being processed through your Irish payroll. That is never legal. It is never compliant under any circumstances. Sorry, I should say one exception for that. If it is someone Irish who is tax resident in Ireland, who is doing work for a short period of time, or for example, they work for a government body, then there will be an exception there. But if you know, you have a German person living in Germany, you can't sign them up to the Irish tax system and process them here. So you'll have to have local payroll professionals. You will have to oversee, or your team will have to oversee, local payroll and interactions with that local tax authority. Often that will have to be done in local language. I spent a lot of my life signing documents in a whole, we have entities in 30 countries. So, you know, we have to interface with those tax authorities. There are not many of them that will deal in English. Some do, but not many. Scandinavian countries tend to be okay with English. In many countries, payroll and tax payments must be made through a local bank account, which was something I was not aware of until I founded Boundless. We, as a business, we have 50 bank accounts, believe it or not.
Wow.
We operate in 16 currencies. We need to have a very specialist team to handle all of that. You know, treasury management starts to become very important then. If you have multiple entities, you will have to deal with intercompany transactions and transfer pricing. So my advice would be hold off on all of the international entities unless it's something you need to do for your business like us. So this being a foreign employer is preferable to having the local entities. You will need local expertise on the HR side. The thing, you know, I can't really emphasize it enough. The thing that where it gets particularly difficult is tricky terminations. Excuse me. In many countries, the type of external HR advisory that we're familiar with in the UK and Ireland is not a thing. It just doesn't exist. Again, something I learned when we founded Boundless. We work with a HR advisory here in Ireland. We work with one in the UK. Excuse me. For many countries, this needs to be done through an employment lawyer. Excuse me.
RAD.
I've had one ready to go just in case. I'm going to suck on a throat lozenge while I talk. I'm very sorry.
Of course, no, not to worry, no need to apologize. If I could take over, I would. But
Thank
you're
you.
clearly the expert in the room.
I've had this cough since Saturday. I was
Oh,
praying I was better today. Um, so the type of HR advisory you might be familiar with is not a thing.
okay.
We'd end up spending a lot of money with employment lawyers.
Mm,
And managing payroll, benefits, and other HR functions remotely can be tricky. So let's talk now about an employer of record. So our
yeah.
company, Boundless, is an employer of record.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, I carry heavy internal bias around employer of record. So, I'm obviously big on it as a solution, but you're going to need to consider what's right for your business and the stage that you're at. It's
Yeah.
not always the right solution. This employing international teams via an employer of record is a fully compliant option in most cases. There might be some exceptions, like when you go over a certain size in a country,
Okay.
or when a worker has been with you beyond a certain period of time. Some countries have limitations there. There are some countries, now the only one I'm aware of, but there are 150 countries in the world. We only operate in 30. The example I would give is Spain, where the employer of record model is prohibited as an employment method. The only compliant route in Spain is to employ people directly, which is really painful for people.
Okay.
We have people in Spain ourselves. A lot of employers of record will support Spain, but they're doing so non-compliantly. It is not legal. So be aware that if you believe what you're paying them for is compliance, that is not what you are getting there.
Wow.
The
That's a good
pros
tip.
of this, the pros of this are that you can have an unlimited headcount in any number of countries, and you can launch operations in a new country in a matter of minutes rather than months. So for most countries, we can get an employee set up following day. There are some countries where it's a requirement that a worker has a medical before starting work, or where there need to be wetting signatures and employment agreements, such as in Germany. So that would take us about 2 weeks. But generally, it can be done in hours. This is a top tier employee experience. So from the worker's perspective, assuming that you're working with the right employer of record for your needs and requirements, the employer of record will act as the legal employer locally, but the employee will see their hiring company referenced on their employment agreements. And the employer of record will fully support the employee and your team with navigating local compliance. So you will have at your fingertips all of the knowledge that you need to ensure that your worker has a good experience, that you're meeting all of your employer obligations, and that they're receiving all of the benefits that they should be receiving. I should go back actually and just explain the employer of record model. An employer of record will have entities across multiple countries. What we do is regulated in many countries. It's not in Ireland, but we hold licenses in country where that's a requirement. And that means that we can act as your local legal employer locally on the ground. So our customer has a commercial agreement with us, and we then handle the setup of the employment agreement for the worker. We process the payroll, file the taxes, handle the benefits on your behalf.
Yeah.
From the worker's perspective, it's full employment, so they can apply for a mortgage, for example.
Yeah.
And they get all of their entitlements.
And Dee, just to clarify there, their employment contract then still sits with your client, I presume, and that it's just, as you say, mentioned that you're the hiring company then in terms of the payroll. Is that how it works?
So the employer of record is actually the legal employer. They're
Okay.
the primary employer. The model that we operate at Boundless is our employment agreements will have Boundless named as the primary employer with responsibility for compliance, processing payroll, filing taxes. The customer is the organization that owns the relationship with the worker, allocates work, and manages performance. So they're named and the employment agreement. It evolves. Every country has very specific rules and regulations around contract law and employment agreements.
Right.
So, and around employer of record. So it can vary a little in some countries, but that's broadly how it works.
Okay. Hopefully that's helpful to everyone. Thank you.
So cons on this one, partnering with an employer of record that prioritizes compliance is critical.
Mhm.
There is a reality that compliance is not a top priority for every employer of record. You want your employer of record to shield you from risk,
Yeah.
not blindly say yes to everything you ask. You know, they should be guiding you on what is and is not allowed in that territory. This is a space that has gotten very busy in the last few years, and there are many players that rushed into the space. They're aggregators. They don't actually own their own infrastructure. They're selling to you, but it's different employers of record at the back end. So it's difficult for you to know then how compliant they are. You haven't due diligence them. It's difficult to know what the level of quality will be.
Okay.
So we'll talk in a bit. Conscious we're tight on time, so I might start to speed up a bit. It can be expensive, you know, employer of record it's not a low cost option. Depending on who you work with, could be riddled with hidden fees. It's always worth really asking about all of the costs. And then if the employer of record, you know, you need to be sure that they're responsive and that they have their own team of HR, payroll, and legal experts, so that when you have issues, you will be talking to their team. If they are having to go to a third party, everything will slow down, and you know, that could be difficult. So how do you find the right approach for you? To make a smart decision about this, you're going to have to look at a number of variables. How many employees do you have? How many are you looking to employ internationally? Across how many countries? What are those countries? What's your team structure? Do you have an in-house HR, payroll, and legal team that can support the approach that you're going to take, or are you very lean on that? What's your budget? So how much budget do you have to dedicate each year to the compliance aspect of employment? Something else really worth thinking about, and we released an ebook on this earlier in the week. We can actually share a link to the ebook to everyone attending today. The cost of employer taxes varies anywhere from about 1.5% up to 50%.
Wow.
So the country that the worker or workers are in will have a big impact on your costs. So it's worth looking at that as well. What are your support needs? That will be linked to your team structure, but also depending, are these very senior employees? Do you care deeply as a company about employee experience? Is that something that really matters to your workers? And then what is the importance of compliance to you? If you operate in a regulated space, if you're a financial services company, you will really care about compliance. If you're very early stage, your space is not regulated, you may make a call to have an appetite for a slightly higher level of risk in your first 12 months or 18 months. And then you start to adjust that down as you grow. So while tricky in their own right, you might think that registering as an employer, procuring local employment contracts, and setting up payroll and taxes will put you in a position to start employing workers in a new country. But really, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've already touched on some of these things today. The reality is that to support international workers, you have to cover a whole load of bases. And your HR team, potentially your payroll team, your finance team, your legal team, they might all be the same people. I know I have been that person at previous organizations. They may have to find local benefits providers. Yeah. You would certainly need to understand local HR compliance. You know, you need to think about what level of support you'll need given the team that you have, and given that these are the things that need to be taken care of. You will want to outsource some of these. So are you going to go the direct employment route or the foreign employer route and hire accountants and lawyers locally in country? Or would you work with an employer of record and just outsource all of this? if you don't have that expertise on your own team. So when we consider employer of record versus in-house HR, if your company is handling all of this directly, your HR function will become consumed by the challenges of supporting your overseas workers, and that may be the right move for you. So, for example, what happens when you have requests for parental or maternity leave in Germany, if you have a tricky employee termination in France, or if you need to refresh your Canadian benefits policies? In each case, your HR professionals may find themselves grappling with complex legislation in a jurisdiction where they're lacking direct expertise. You might have worker classification issues or non-compliance with local employer obligations. That could leave you dealing with costly litigation and fines from local authorities. Again, do you have people on your team that can support that? We have a team where people have dealt with things like this in previous organizations. So we have a team with a lot of international expertise, but that's core to our business. If going with doing this in-house, you will need to ensure you have the right resources in place, both in terms of your legal teams and in terms of your external vendors. So you can solve for a lot of this with external vendors, but again, it comes back to that question of, do you have a team in-house that are used to managing those external vendor relationships, and do they have the capacity for that? So let's consider some key factors you might want to look at when deciding on the best employer of record for your company. I'm not going to go too deep into this because we don't have a huge amount of time left, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. But consider the level of support that you'll need, the cost structure that you're comfortable with, and the level of commitment to compliance. So there are some questions that you will want to ask as you evaluate an employer of record. What is their country reach? How many countries are they supporting? And do they own the in-country infrastructure directly, or are they an aggregator working through partners? What will the employee experience be like? Do they have a tech platform that both you and the employees can log into? Do they have a comprehensive benefits offering? Ease of use? Again, back to that tech platform. If there's no tech platform, you may find yourself filling in a load of spreadsheets at various times in the month. Can you easily access employment documents and up-to-date country information? What's the cost structure? Are there any hidden charges? What is their response and resolution time? I would ask that question very overtly. What's their average response time? What's their average time to resolution? If they can't answer that question immediately, that tells you something about how they view quality. Yeah. It's an indicator they're not measuring this. And do they offer unlimited support for HR issues? I've heard people say that they had a tricky termination, and I've heard the expression, they threw me under the bus. I've heard that a number of times. Or where you will be charged for all time spent on a tricky termination. In my mind, this level of support, that's what you're paying an employer of record for. It's a bit like an insurance policy. You really figure out it's worth when you have a problem. And then, are they operating appropriate employment models in each country? And what's their track record and payroll accuracy? Again, they should be able to share some data with you on that. A little bit of a rush there towards the end, but any more questions?
Dee, that was excellent. And we did have some questions submitted in advance, and I do think that some of it's been covered. But one of the questions was, could you clarify if it's possible for the company in Ireland to hire an employee who resides outside the country more than 180 days, and what the tax implications would be for such an arrangement?
So in most cases, the regulations that will apply there will be, you will need to look at Ireland, but then you will need to look at the country where the worker is on those other days. You don't get to choose your tax residency, it's dictated to you. Now, obviously, you could make a choice, you could consciously choose to spend X number of days in a country in order to influence your tax obligations. But it will be driven by the number of days you are in a country. The 180 rule, broadly, it's the one to look at, because for most countries, it is, are you 6 months and a day? And they look at overnights. It's all about overnights
Right.
in that country. And for most countries, once you reach that threshold, you will have a tax obligation in the country. Some countries you'll reach that obligation earlier. It can be a shorter period of time. So
Right.
you need to look at the country or countries that the worker is spending their time in.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, some probably specific advice needed there with regards to what the countries are. The same have specified hiring for remote work for Germany and or German and Swiss residents. They are living in Germany and Switzerland and would remain there as an Irish company. But as you've touched on there, that there's nuances to both of those countries. You know, you won't be able to treat both with the same.
So
Yeah, so that's
very
really
different
helpful.
regulations, actually, Switzerland and Germany. Yeah.
Yeah. We've had another question as well. Which country is most preferred by Irish companies for hiring to minimize salary expenses and achieve cost savings?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah,
You know what? I wonder, can I pull it up here? I'm going
sure.
to pull up something that I may or may not have open here.
Okay.
Um, hmm, let's see, employment cost infographic. Here we go. This is not the one I was looking for,
Okay.
but so I'm not as familiar with this one as the other document I was looking for. Yes, this is employment costs.
Hmm.
Um, I'm going to follow up. This isn't the document I was looking for. I'm going to follow up with an ebook, a link to an ebook that I'll send to each of you. This ebook
Great.
was just published this week. It covers 32 countries in Europe.
Wow.
And you can look at that and see on a scale the lowest cost to the highest cost countries in Europe when it comes to employer taxes. Am I going to be able to remember correctly? No, I'm not even going to hazard a guess at it. The most expensive one is France, I'm pretty sure. But
Okay.
yeah, lower cost. I can't quite remember, so I'll
Yeah.
share it with you. But
That,
yeah, when you say most preferred, I mean,
mm, to
there's a
minimize salary expenses and achieve cost savings, he had mentioned there. So I'm sure
yeah,
it'll be covered in the ebook
and I
potentially.
mean, I don't meet many companies that take that approach to hiring because it's about where the talent is.
Right.
So we would see Irish companies with a lot of workers, obviously the UK, that would be
Hmm.
number
Of
one.
course.
France, Portugal, US, that's where we'd see a lot of people. But I mean, France and Portugal are not the lower cost countries.
No. Okay. And I think it's been really beneficial how you've given a real sense of criteria in choosing an employment partner and you know what really questions to ask them and your highlight on compliance being a level of importance has been really beneficial as well. I was just going to ask if you had examples of I suppose companies that have started the process themselves from an in-house point of view and then transitioned over to you guys because they've hit a stumbling block.
It's
Is that where you
all the
typically see
time,
it? Yeah.
all the
Okay.
time. It is extremely common for us to
Okay.
get on a call with a
Hmm.
company. It's smaller companies
Yeah.
because companies where anyone on the team has any experience of working internationally, we will hear all the time when we get to price,
Hmm.
people say all the time, oh, that's great value. You know, what you
Right.
provide, what you do, it's really good value.
Hmm.
Smaller companies are people that have never employed someone internationally before, perceive employer of record as expensive.
Okay.
So we charge about 8.4% of the value of the payroll processed.
Okay.
And people view that as expensive if they have not done these things before. Very often on a sales call, people will say, too expensive, going to do it directly. You know, I've looked and I can establish an entity for 250 quid. I'm going to go and do that.
Right.
All the time, people go, they invest months of time, effort, blood,
Hmm.
sweat, and tears, and they come back and say that was an absolute nightmare. We've been 4 or 5 months trying to get the entity set up, still don't even have an entity. Actually, what you do is good value. We'll work with you now.
Yeah, that's it. And I think you've really presented that actually in today's presentation, where there are just so many nuances and so many considerations where you could look at one option and think, yes, that's the easiest option for me. But even all of those have limitations and limits, from the contractor to having an entity there, whatever the options may be that
I
people
would
would
say
consider.
I've done a lot of business. I lived in the UK for 12
Yeah,
years. UK is really straightforward. It's the same
great.
language. It's a very similar system to Ireland. HMRC, their website is fantastic.
Hmm.
The company's house, fantastic, really easy, really low cost. You'll have no trouble finding an accountant there. Surely someone you know will be able to point you towards one. That's as easy as it gets. Um, so you might do that directly, but we've a lot of Irish clients that have done UK directly themselves before, but they
Yeah,
choose to use us for UK because it's just easier.
just easier. That's
Yeah,
it.
just
Yeah.
easier. Things like pensions enrollment and things like that. If the
Yes.
in-house Irish team are not familiar with it, it's easier
Yeah.
to hand it away.
Yeah. A couple of follow-up questions that we've gotten, just if you have another minute. If an Irish company hires an employee who subsequently leaves the country for a period of 3 months, is it necessary to revise the employment contract?
So when you say leaves the country for a period of 3 months, it's very dependent on where they go to.
Okay. Yeah.
So generally speaking, for a working holiday, now 3 months is a point in time where you might want to look at that. But
Mm.
if someone's going somewhere for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, our own team, we give them the flexibility to do working holidays for that kind of period of time. And it's not a problem. You're from the vast majority of countries, you won't be creating any tax obligation by someone being on a working holiday for a few weeks. But 3 months is about the point where you need to look at that country that they're in. If they're
Yeah.
moving around, it's probably not such a problem. And you would just keep them on, they will be tax resident in a country, and you would keep them on an employment agreement that's compliant with the country they're tax resident in.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that, Dee. And thank you so much for all of your insight and all of your patience, particularly with your cough. I really appreciate it. So, thanks so much, and looking forward to hosting webinars with you in the future, because that was so insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, and I do apologize for the coughing. Thank you for your
Not at
patience.
all. Thanks now. I hope everyone found it beneficial. And as I say, a recording will be sent to you all, and hopefully the link to that ebook will be sent to you all in a follow-up email. Thanks for your time, Dee. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.